I am happy to introduce Jason Stanley to all of you. Jason is this Jacob Orowski, professor of philosophy at Yale University. Before coming to Yale in 2013, he was distinguished professor in the Department of Philosophy at Rutgers University. He has written several books, including How Propaganda Works, which won the 2016 Prose Award for Philosophy. Tonight, he will be talking about his new book, How Fascism Works. In this clear and direct primer, Stanley draws on a wide range of history, philosophy, sociology, and critical race theory to define fascism, explain its mechanisms, and help people identify its red flags. At its most basic level, fascism is simply a movement that achieves power by dividing a population. A country can have fascist strains without actually being fascistic, Stanley says. And he identifies myriad seeds of authoritarianism in US history, from the Confederacy and the Jim Crow South, which inspired Hitler, to the more recent birther movement and the rise of Trump. More generally, he cites 10 hallmarks of fascism, such as the mythic past, propaganda, anti-intellectualism, and unreality. On the rise today, these must be resisted if we are to stop fascism from gaining hold here. In their review of the book, Publishers Weekly says that Stanley is an erudite guide, and his convincing analysis of forces at work in present-day politics is accessible to experts and novices alike. Everyone, let us please welcome Jason Stanley.
So, thanks. So I thought I would say a little bit about why another Crisis of Democracy book, because I'm sure that a lot of you have been at talks with a few Crisis of Democracy books. So why another Crisis of Democracy books? Well, Crisis of Democracy books work by in the recent group, many of which are written by friends of mine, are written as if we had this healthy and thriving liberal democracy, and then Russia came. And boy, it really threw us off our game. And they're written as if fascism is something completely foreign to the United States, as if it's a European thing. It's clearly like an Italian word. And so it has no business being in our wonderful, good old boy United States. Now, I wrote my book because I think this is too complacent. The whole crisis, I agree with a lot of the critics, like Jedediah Purdy of the Crisis of Democracy literature. It's a real failing of that literature because we're not going to be able to fight the problematic forces in our country unless we recognize them as native born. I mean, not really native born, but you know what I mean. So we're not going to recognize the problems that we face unless we see that, for instance, in Mein Kampf, Hitler praises the United States as a model of the nation state, of the national state that he is there trying to set up. He praises our 1924 Immigration Act. So just recently, we've had a move to constrain immigration, to just be very strict about the health of immigrants coming. That's very reminiscent of the 1924 Immigration Act, in particular the 1920s, when eugenics and there was a huge focus on the health of when President Trump talked about people from shithole countries coming, and how come we don't get people from Norway anymore? Well, that is right out of 1924. Hitler in Mein Kampf, in Hitler's second book, he praises the United States for restricting immigration to people to Europe select, and to people who are healthy, strong from a health point of view. And we hear those echoes all around us. So unless we see our own complicity in European fascism, we're never going to be able to truly deal with our susceptibility, because our susceptibility links to who we are as Americans. As there's a book in the back, not to sell my colleagues' books, but there's a book by Jim Whitman in the back called Hitler's American Model, which is about the Nrnberg Laws. And it's about how the lawyers, the Nuremberg lawyers, came to the United States to study our anti-miscegenation laws. And they were like, and they're, of course, it's very fascist, because fascism is about purity. The first laws you have to have are ones restricting intermarriage, right? So the Nuremberg laws, they came over here, they studied our laws. They were trying to figure out who is a Jew in Germany. And then they looked at our laws and they're like, okay, that one drop thing, that's kind of crazy. Let's go with 1/8. That's a little bit more. So we were viewed as very radical. Our anti-miscegenation laws were considered radical by the National Socialist jurists. That's what Jim Whitman's book is about. We were considered to be an extreme state. There's a book by Nancy MacLean. Also, these parallels between European fascism and what's happening in the United States. Of course, they have not gone unmentioned. Nancy MacLean's 1994 book, Behind the Mask of Chivalry, is about the Ku Klux Klan. And she remarks, she talks about how the Ku Klux Klan is about protecting the traditional family, hearkening back to a great America, and warning of the dangers of racial of black people, black rapists, supposed black rapists, and Jews and communists. And this, of course, is a politics that straightforwardly goes over to Germany. In my book, I talk about the campaign that in the early 1920s to raise panic about Senegalese soldiers in the Rhineland. There was a huge propaganda campaign. Weirdly enough, it was before Facebook, too. But it was a huge propaganda campaign, so much so that I think there was a rally of 10,000 people in Madison Square Garden about the Black Horror on the Rhine. It was a German propaganda campaign to say, Hitler says, I have a quote from Hitler there saying the Jews have brought, black soldiers to rape our women on the Rhineland. And so it was, so this politics of panic and fear, the racial politics of the United States, this is, fascism is homegrown. Why? So I should address this point immediately, that my agent, when I first got an agent, asked me, why a philosopher writing about fascism? You're not a historian. Why a philosopher? So now, one argument, besides the fact that this sort of erases Hannah Arendt and Adorno and some other people who've written about fascism, who are philosophers. Du Bois is a philosopher, and Du Bois, to make this point again about the United States, in the beginning of Black Reconstruction, Du Bois tells this little vignette. He's like, the world was wonderful. God made the world was wonderful. There was peace and harmony. And then he threw a black man into the midst, and fascism broke out. So one more vignette about the connection. Will Rogers, Timothy Snyder's brother, found this for me. Will Rogers has a column from 1933 where he says, it doesn't look to me that Hitler wants to be Mussolini. He doesn't want to be emperor. He wants to be Kliegel. It's the KKK he's imitating. So these connections were quite clear at the time. Certainly to Du Bois, everything's clear to Du Bois, most things. But philosophers, Du Bois, of course, is a historian and philosopher. He counts as everything. But historians, I think that what philosophers do is we make generalizations. We make generalizations that are, of course, faulty, because no generalization is perfect. And of course, Nancy MacLean excoriated me, saying, well, fascism, of course, requires panic about communists. So you do find this panic about communists in the 1920s in the South, but you don't find any communists. So she was pointing that out to me, and she's like, "That's a difference. You actually had communists in Germany." I'm like, "Yeah, that's a difference." But so there are these differences. There are going to be differences. There are differences between. In my book, I range extremely widely. I talk about the Hindutva movement in India. I talk about, if it were written today, I would talk about a topic that I'm being interviewed about every other day, Bolsonaro in Brazil. So uh, so uh, so I talk about a range of different hyper nationalist movements, and they are connected. I mean, RSS in India is deeply influenced by Hitler, by actual European fascism, and of course Modi was originally as a youth a member of the RSS. So the Hindutva movement is connect. So there are these connections, but what we're seeing right now, is something that requires generalization, and a historian, this project needs to be done in tandem with historians, but it also needs to be done. I think that there's a reason we return to Arendt. There's a reason we return to Adorno. They make certain generalizations that help us spot what's happening around us. They obscure certain differences, of course, but there are important generalizations. Now, why do we need a book on fascism after Arendt wrote Origins of Totalitarianism? Well, if you go back to the 50s literature, what you'll find is there's two different streams of thinking. One stream, like Arendt, theorizes authoritarianism. That's what Arendt does in Origins of Totalitarianism. That's the dominant theme, to theorize authoritarianism. So Arendt goes back and forth between Stalin and Hitler, and she's theorizing them together. And as a result, there is nothing in Origins of Totalitarianism on patriarchy. And you are not talking about fascism unless you're talking about patriarchy. Patriarchy is the very core of fascism. But rhetorically, a lot of communist movements, a lot of even authoritarian communist movements, are not patriarchal. Communism, when it suppresses liberty, is harshly, rhetorically egalitarian. Of course, people use that for nefarious purposes and manipulate the ideals of equality. But Stalin. But what you find in communist rhetoric is a different structure than what you find in fascist rhetoric. You don't find macho strongmen talking about I mean, you do to some extent because there's overlaps. I mean, Chavez did do some macho strongman stuff, but you don't find them talking about how women should be at home and the racial minorities are lazy, and you don't find them basing an us-them distinction on race, ethnicity, religion, or nationalism. They base it rather on class, and that's rhetorically different. So when you're theorizing, to theorize all authoritarianism together will make you miss very specific threats. I do not think that we face, despite what you might hear about Hillary Clinton, I do not think we face a threat of encroaching communism. That was a joke. And it is of course fascist politics to paint the center left as communists. Goebbels says the ordinary burger will not vote for us unless we terrify him that by painting the center left, the ordinary center left, and the ordinary intellectuals as communists, out as Bolshevik, out to come for their property. So Goebbels repeatedly recommends painting the ordinary center-left party, the Social Democrats, as Bolsheviks, and then paints that and urges Nazi propaganda to create fear of the theft of their property. To address ordinary citizens and say, the communists are coming and they're going to take your property, and they're hiding under the mask of these bourgeois centrist intellectuals. Sound familiar? Liberals, everyone needs to go read Protocols of the Elders of Zion. I have it, but it's you hear it all the time now. But it's you'll read it and you'll be like, wow, I saw that speech. So you don't need Jews for the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion is about the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is about liberals. Liberalism is, of course, supposed to be a Jewish plot, which I'm happy to take credit, or but liberalism, and there is Spinoza. But liberalism is supposed to be a Jewish plot to come to when you spread liberalism into people's hearts, then they'll, as the protocol says, then they'll willingly give their power to you. They'll willingly give up their power. Because liberalism has two values, liberty and equality, right? And if everyone is allowed to practice their own traditions and their own ways of being, then you have to give people space. You have to move the Christmas tree over, or in Israel, I guess, the menorah over, and make space for something else. Equality. The dominant group will have to, women's equality means that men will have to give up some of their prestige and power. In fascist politics, you represent that as a takeover attempt. In fascist politics, you represent equality as always a hypocritical mask to take over. So feminism, African-American studies departments, I mean, this wasn't Hitler's example, but African-American studies departments are really attempts to take over and supplant Shakespeare. Familiar? So this is the protocols. This is the protocols. The protocols is all about how equality is a myth. Political freedom is the expression they use, and that's a myth. And people are only ever spread that myth in order to take power from you, because one group must rule. You know that fascist politics is taking hold when the dominant group feels like the world's greatest victims. On October 12th, 2017, Viktor Orban in the International Conference for the Persecution of Christians in Budapest said, there's no doubt that Christians are the world's most persecuted religion. And this is, of course, and you can see, I mean, one thing I said back to Nancy MacLean when she challenged me about this, and because if you look at the KKK, or you look at the right, as I discussed, the origins of the right to work movement, which is now, one hears, more successful than it was in the 40s. The origins of the right to work movement, there was all this stuff about how labor unions were Jewish communist plots. This is another feature of fascism. There are certain things that surprised me in my research. This theme, again and again, of the importance of labor unions. And then you realize later, well, it's obvious. Martin Niemöller's poem has a line in it. Then they came for the trade unionists. But who would have thought, labor unions are always the targets in fascism, everywhere, in Spain, in Germany. That's why Martin Niemöller lists it along with socialists and Jews, trade unionists, because unions are, so fascism is an us-them distinction that creates a bond creates an us apart from them based on racial identity or religious identity or ethnic identity. And class identity, creating an us along class identity lines, is the polar opposite. So in Black Reconstruction, Du Bois is the whole story of Black Reconstruction is about how Reconstruction ends because the wealthy white Northern industrialists recognize that that poor blacks and poor whites in the South are creating a labor movement. And okay, white Panther Planter class, you're right, that's bad. And so then it's to break the emerging labor movement that they remove the power of black Southerners to vote. Arendt is very clear about this in Origins. So you're reading Du Bois and Arendt together, and both of them are yelling, a weapon against fascism is labor unions, and fascists know that. And when you break down labor unions, you break down ways of connecting across race and gender and religion and ethnicity. Labor unions are about material interests. We all have aging parents, or not so aging parents in my case, we all like weekends. I mean, they're disappearing quickly, but they were fun while they lasted. And we all have those material interests. So that bonds us across race and religions. You got to smash that if you want to to make people connect across, make people just connect across their race. And then once you do that, then you can tell them their racial identity is priceless. And this is Du Bois's notion of the psychological wages of whiteness, where he says the psychological wages of whiteness are priceless. That's why the poor whites. I mean, when you read our newspapers and they talk about poor whites and the working class whites, as if these phrases have no American history. There's a chapter in Black Reconstruction called "A Poor White." So Du Bois's notion of psychological wages of whiteness is essential for thinking about fascism. Victor Klemperer in Language of the Third Reich has a chapter called "I Believe in Him," and it could be called "The Psychological Wages of Germanness," and in the middle of it he's talking about. You always hear, to set it up, I always hear people saying, well, when President Trump, to take an example, when his supporters don't realize they're not getting the material benefits they expected, they will he'll lose their support. Unfortunately, that is not how this kind of politics works. It's not a politics of material benefit. It's a politics of loyalty. Fascism is about loyalty and power. It replaces material interests, it replaces truth and reality by loyalty and power. As Arendt says, the fascists resemble mafia bosses. They stock their administrations with family members and people from their businesses because of loyalty. And that's consistent. So I don't look at people who do that and say they're being inconsistent. I say, no, good, you're being consistent because loyalty is your thing. So what in that chapter, I Believe in Him, Klemperer is talking about how much the psychological wages of Germanness tied Germans to Hitler even well beyond the point at which they should have. April 1945, the Red Army is in the gates of Berlin, and Klemperer is trudging through the woods with a soldier missing an arm. And he says to the soldier, I guess it's time to give up. And the soldier says, what do you mean? Hitler's got them trapped. And Klemperer says, what? This soldier's a young man. He's lost his arm. What is he? And Klemperer says, and the soldier says, yeah, it's Hitler's birthday's coming up, and Hitler just meant to suck the Red Army in and trap them. He's never lied to us yet. And Klemperer says, he'd been lying consistently year after year after year after year. I mean, literally, people would, till the last moment. I mean, I've spent years of my life in Germany, and I've met people who still believe in him. So, the bond of loyalty, what fascist politics tries to do is it tries to break down any of your connection to your material interests and say, well, what you have is you have your national identity, your ethnic identity, and your bond with the leader. And that's why, and that bond is so powerful and so meaningful to people that they will, they will just to see that they will it will last through great trial and tribulation. It will last through certainly the loss of their material interests. And if you look at countries that suffer from fascist politics, I would say Russia right now is one. You can see that the leader becomes very popular even as people's economic situation becomes worse. So you can't wait around for, when their health insurance gets taken away, no, it doesn't work like that. I mean, these are, Erdogan in Turkey. I mean, these are leaders who win elections, and they win elections by a politics of loyalty. They win elections by lying. I'll talk for 5 more minutes, and then take questions. So I'm going through. So what I do in my book is I give you a template. Of signs. I am an analytic philosopher, but I'm not. That's one of the many things I am. But I sort of militantly did not pay attention to the world, as my stepmother and my father would always remind me. So until birtherism. So my first New York Times piece in 2011 was about birtherism, because I had read enough Arendt to realize that was weird. That shouldn't happen in a democracy. And I recognize the trap. The trap is something that's familiar from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. In my family, both my parents are Holocaust survivors. My mother and father, 2 of my 3 parents, are Holocaust survivors. And so obviously, Protocols of the Elders of Zion is something you talk about when you're very young, and some advantages. So this trap of, Hitler said the lying press, the press is owned by the Jews, and you can tell because they never talk about the press being owned by the Jews. So that's a trap. That's a familiar trap, very familiar. I recognized it immediately. I immediately was like, maybe I should write something not on the left parentheses. So in 2011, I wrote my first New York Times piece about that. The trap always works like this. Mr. Trump, President Trump, when he came to political consciousness, he went on an interview in Fox News and he said, CNN is controlled by the leftists and Obama. You can tell because they're not talking about birtherism. That's the same move that was made in the 30s. The Die Lügenpresse, the mainstream press, they're controlled by the Jews because they don't say they're controlled by the Jews. The Law and Justice Party in Poland, the hilariously misnamed Law and Justice Party, comes to power in 2015 in a country that had been whose GDP had been going up. Civic Platform had done very well. So it wasn't economic anxiety. It's not economic anxiety in Bavaria either. But they did this move too. I'm emphasizing this because Comet Pizza is right here. So I can't not talk about the conspiracy theories as a sign. So what PIS did, what Law and Justice did, is there was a Smolensk disaster which was admittedly horrific, when a plane carrying all of Poland's political leaders and business leaders and military leaders crashed, and everyone was killed. And there were about between 20 and 25 conspiracy theories about that crash. It was pilot error. But admittedly, it was hard to believe it was pilot error. So Law and Justice rode that to power. It was all about the conspiracy, and it was the communists, and it was there are no communists in Poland, but it was just like there were very few communists in the American South, but the KKK still acted like there were. It was the communists, it was the Russians, it was the liberals who were hiding the real facts of who brought that plane down. And you could tell that the newspapers were owned by the people who did it because they didn't report on it. And when I saw birtherism, I was like, oh yeah, that's familiar. And conspiracy theories work in a weird way, and I'll end with this, only in deference to Comet Pizza. Conspiracy theories function to break down the epistemological spaces. They function to break down, they're simple narratives that make sense of panic, fear, in Poland's case, sadness and loss, paranoia. They're not meant to be taken at face value. So Edgar Madison Welch, when he walked in, so this is a point that my colleague at UConn, Michael Lynch, had made, which I think is very powerful. He pointed out that when Edgar Madison Welch walked in and fired 3 shots in that restaurant, 3 or 4 shots, I'm not exactly sure how many, he was acting rationally, right? If you thought that the Democratic Party was running a child sex ring in the basement of Comet Pizza, by all means, go and free the children. But he was immediately denounced by Alex Jones and everybody else as a spy for the Democratic Party. So Michael Lynch makes this point to point out conspiracy theories, you're doing the wrong thing if you believe them. They're just supposed to make you, hate the target more. They're just supposed to make you hate the target more. They're not supposed to be believed like that. So what I do in my book is I give you 10 properties of fascist politics. The book is not about fascist government. I'm not saying, it's about fascist, and the difference between fascist government and fascist politics is tricky anyway, because fascism is about power. So fascism is a method to come to power. People are always like, well, do you really believe that do such and such people like President Trump, do they really believe? You really believe he believes the things that other fascist movements believe? And my response is it doesn't matter, because fascism isn't about belief. It's about power. So it doesn't matter. Like, it's first hit me when I was reading Richard Grunberger's 1975 work on, thanks to my father's library. I have a rich collection of history, sociology, philosophy, and psychology of the Nazis. So, and much else. But he says, many people think of the Nazis as morally pure anti-Semites. They were devoted to killing Jews and definitely believed in it and got up and were very neat. But actually, a lot of them were just thugs. They were just mafia gangsters. And they didn't care about killing Jews. They cared about money. They cared about Jewish art and property. But they were doing the devoted anti-Semitism thing. They didn't care about it. What they cared about was the profits they got from it. And that's, I think, what we need to focus on when we think about fascism. It's a tactic. It's a way to delude us, to seize power and retain power. And it has its lengthy history in our own country. Okay, thank you. Right, he did. He started his campaign in the in that county for the what was it? Philadelphia, Mississippi. Right. I forgot the name of the county fair. But where Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney were, near where Schwerner, Cheney, and certainly we have the welfare queen trope, that, the racial coding. Now, I think that one thing you get, so you have these really tripling down on America's racial history, on American racism. In those campaigns, you have militarism, and you have the aspect, and you have something that is the last chapter of my book, social Darwinism, which is connected in certain ways to economic libertarianism, although it's inconsistent in various ways. But the idea is, I talk about Hitler's speech to the industrialists. Fascists talk about winners and losers, makers and takers. It's all about, who wins has value, who loses has no value, so that whole way of going. On the other hand, Reagan does not explicitly, fascists are harshly anti-democratic. You don't have the enemy of the state. Okay, to go on the Reagan, I mean, look, there's going to be a lot of overlaps between between various forms of conservatism and fascist politics. But we can't condemn everybody. We can't say it's a spectrum. Fascist politics is a spectrum, and our familiar conservatives are going to be on that spectrum, just like Bernie Sanders is going to be on the spectrum to something much more extreme. I mean, he's on the spectrum to Denmark, but yeah, there are certain things he says that are going to be on the spectrum to bad leftist authoritarianism. So there is this spectrum, and I don't mean to. And we have in a liberal democracy, we have to have social conservatives, we have to have libertarians, we have to have progressives and socialists. We have to have this spectrum. We're going to have this spectrum. But what happens when you get something really worrisome, which I don't think you quite had, you didn't have with Reagan, is when you have these different things. I mean, look at Reagan on immigration, for instance. I mean, he isn't demagoguing on immigration. He isn't, when you have these overlaps, when you have, social conservatives, business corporate elites, libertarians all coming together, and nationalists coming together and saying, let's have a group, a constellation. And we might disagree on certain things, but let's unify. And then you can get fascist constellations there. But I think, I think Reagan had elements that are there, but also we have to remember that lots of, just like, you wouldn't want to say that, very socially progressive policies, just because they do that in communist countries, that's communist. So I wouldn't want to paint Reagan as engaging in fascist politics. He's not harshly anti-democratic in the way that you find with.
Just to respond really quickly, I guess my thing was the militarism and really the dangerous militarism during
the empire.
The building of the empire and the strong the strong racist tone of things. It really
and those are overlaps, and I think disanalogy now is you don't find President Trump actually being as empire oriented. I mean, it's tricky there. People will say, I think now people use fascist politics. They used to use it in the 30s. It was used to mobilize people for war. Now it's used to demobilize people. So it's a set of techniques, and and it overlaps with techniques, and people use some of them. There's a spectrum. And
I want to thank you. I think this is a very important discussion, and I'm from the Caribbean, grew up in the Netherlands, and spent quite a significant amount of my time there in a different type of Netherlands than it's become, sadly enough, right? When I was in the Netherlands, if you had told them that,
carrot builders.
I mean, these guys would be 20-30% of the population. Literally, people would lock you up and put you in a psychiatric institution and say, you're thinking too much. You literally kind of lost it, This is not what the Netherlands is about. We are, civilized, good, decent people. Although, they have a very horrific history of colonialism, which is not talked about at home. But the issue is a few questions. And these questions, I think, are provoked by some of the things you said. I think you're onto something quite profound when you said that what we are dealing with now is a demobilized, depoliticized, and de-ideologized populations not only in America. See, if this was only happening in the United States, okay, but I'm so-called French Dutch. I mean, between brackets, right? I'm from the Caribbean, but so-called French Dutch. This France, right? The last elections, right? People were panicked that Marine Le Pen walks into the White House, right? And we know if she walks there, what is going to happen. She made it very clear. One of the big problems I see is that in Europe, potentially, the Muslims become the new Jews.
Absolutely.
Muslims become the new Jews, right? But the issue that I want to deal with here is a more profound issue. That this type of fascism is indeed to mobilize and demobilize.
Right.
In essence, what Hugo Habermas talks about, the legitimacy crisis of the West, right? And the big problem is when you have a legitimate crisis not taking place on one level alone, right? Economic, social, political, legal, right? Moral, ethical, domestic, international, on all different levels, the white West and not is facing crisis on crisis on crisis that are feeding back in and creating problems. Another problem that you have in the West, and I think this is a major problem, and I didn't think you touched on it, is that if you look at the populations here, right, populations that are so-called democratic, you know, and I'm glad you began claiming that the democracy here was never much of anything at all. It was much more a joke to fool people than democracy. The issue is that in these populations a long time, 20 to 30% of the population remain quite fanatically right? Even look what happened with the Communist Party in France, right? The communists move over to the fascists.
They did.
Right?
Yeah,
they literally move over from one authoritarianism to another one, right?
Talks about this.
Tell you how strong the communist identity of brotherhood and sisterhood of people and stuff like that. So, I mean, how do you see, and the big problem that you face is that often these fascistic parties tend to be the most mobilized part of the population.
Right.
While
they show up.
While the majority of the population, although somewhat against, I mean, Hitler never got the majority. He always got 40%. But they are highly mobilized. And
you only need 40%.
Exactly. You only need a small, organized minority to create havoc in society.
Everyone else is scared of.
When everybody's scared. So how do you see, and do you see in a way, in the West at this point in time, really, since the average trade unions are gone, the Socialist and Communist Party are away, and very few intellectuals and academics are really speaking out, are really standing up here and say, wait a minute here, guys, right? You people in the West and the North, you white people in the West and the North, right? I'm saying this kind of provocative because part of, you're absolutely I'm mostly European. I'm most of the European descent.
No, you're absolutely
with Africa.
White people.
But the issue is, you white people in the North, be very careful what you're doing, right? Yeah. Because you are facing a massive influx of black and brown people here because of global warming. What do you do when you look across the Mediterranean? 50, 60 million Africans are about to come. Genocide? You fall back the default position of genocide?
Let me
hear what you got to say.
Yeah, let me just say one quick thing. I'm going to get another question. There's a great series of points that you raised. The climate change point, Timothy Snyder talks about that at the end of Black Earth. He warns that that's our big, and I talk about that in my book as well, picking up on Snyder's points, that climate change is going to lead to immigration crises, to massive immigration that we're going to have to deal with. But let me say something about the point of, the majority-minority point, that, soon the country's going to be majority-minority. President Trump in his campaign always emphasized that. My colleague Jen Richardson, the great social psychologist, she has done this experiment. She's done a number of experiments on this. She presents white Americans with three different groups of white Americans. The first, she says, in 2042, the Netherlands will become majority minority. The second group, she says, in 2042, the United States will become majority senior citizen. And the third group, she says, in 2042, the United States will become majority minority. And then she asks them a series of political questions. The first two groups don't change their mind. Their politics doesn't change. She gets a test of them before of what their political leanings are. The third group of white Americans that's presented with the information that the United States is going to become majority minority becomes more against affirmative action, more against immigration. And interestingly, because Jen Richardson is a genius, she added this, they become much more in favor of increased defense spending. So that, we're going to become a majority minority, it enables right-wing politics, or a certain kind of politics. Maybe not right-wing, but fascist.
Could you talk a little bit more about what appears to be increased white anxiety and white feelings of white victimization, and and talk a little bit about Trump's role? Is he a symptom of something that's going to continue after him, or what happens to fascist movements when leaders disappear?
That's why they always have succession crises. But we have more Trumps. So he is an expert, a real skilled expert at milking white anxiety. There was that quote that he and the psychological wages of whiteness point. Like, remember that thing he said? I don't remember when he said it, but he said something about poor white trash, and someone said, "What is that?" And he said, "Like me, except poor." So that connects. I have great respect for his rhetorical political abilities. We always have this nascent, the dominant group. I mean, think of the men's rights movement. I mean, is there any more aggrieved group on earth than men when their representation in the Senate goes from 98 to like 83 or whatever, or 75? Just look at how men act, and that's what's going on, and that's what happens. Look at France. The example of France is a good example. The aggrieved. We're losing our culture. We're losing our. So that's a big one. Chapter in my book is called Victimhood, and it's all about this. It's a whole chapter just about this.
Could you would you agree that an important benchmark for authoritarianism in this country might have its roots in Eisenhower's farewell address in 1960, I guess, in which the leading general in the world, representing the strongest country in the world, spoke about this fear. And then subsequent to that, you had three of our foremost civil rights leaders slain under dubious circumstances, the official narrative, which only 30% of Americans believe. And then you had this Vietnam War, and there were protests all over the country. There were cities burning. There were people killed at Kent State. And now we have multiple wars, and nobody says a word. So right. What's your take on that?
So I have a lot in my book on Nixon. So when I give talks on that, people, because Nixon is a model for President Trump, of course. Law and Order Politics, Nixon there's a whole protests misrepresented as riots. Think of Baltimore 2015. So I talk in my book about how Fox News used the word riot 7 out of every 1,000 words in describing Baltimore, what happened in Baltimore, and protests only 2 words out of 1,000. CNN used them roughly equally, around 3.5 words per 1,000, riot and protest. And MSNBC used riot 2 words out of 1,000 and protest almost 4 words out of 1,000 to describe Baltimore. So you have this radical partisan difference in descriptions of political protest. The 60s, you really saw that. So much so that someone of my age, I've been 36 for 12 years, I can't even say Detroit protests, because it doesn't come out of my mouth, because I was raised in schools that just taught me Detroit riots, But then you have Catherine Bigelow's movie. Then you realize the actual history, they were protests. And, you just focused on like a few people doing bad things, and you paint them a certain way. So the 60s, Nixon's campaign, again, my book's not about fascist government, it's about fascist politics. I think you see with Nixon a lot of use of fascist politics. And I'm sure you can go back because, as I've been saying, this is us. It's not them.
Do you think the history, the take on Lyndon Johnson might get a more critical view, because he kind of laid the groundwork for Nixon and his involvement in the war, his refusal to get out of it, the pressures that kept him in it.
So in a week, on October 12th at Harvard Bookstore, I'll be in discussion with Elizabeth Hinton, who has written the greatest book about the domestic policies of Johnson and Nixon, from the war on poverty to the war on crime, the making of mass incarceration in America. And that's about the domestic policies. So it's a different point. You're asking about the foreign policy, but I think on domestic policy, there are some issues with Johnson that lead to Nixon as well. I mean, a lot of Johnson's projects in cities were with minority populations were sort of like, here's how to learn to here's how to act like someone with a job or something like that, rather than providing people jobs, which is like, Trump was smarter than, could you imagine Trump going to like rural Michigan and being like, I'm going to teach you how to act like bankers? No, he wasn't doing that. Nixon, so those are interesting questions. And the Hinton book, I think, talks about the hints of Nixon and Johnson while giving him credit for certain things.
So first, I just want to say thank you for coming to talk tonight. It was really interesting. So my question is, or first I'll just say, you mentioned that a tactic of fascists is to caricature the center left as being communists.
Yeah.
But I feel like, or it seemed to me that you made that same mistake when you talked about opposition to unions. Because that seems like a pretty mainstream right view to be opposed to unions.
Right. I don't mean to say that so there's 10 different aspects to fascism. Each one of those aspects is going to be familiar from ordinary conservative politics.
Okay.
It's the combination. But it just didn't occur to me that opposition to labor unions is a uniform feature of all fascism. I learned that in doing the research for my book. So no, you can have good, sound economic reasons. There are good for each of these things. For each of these properties. You can be. Some of the hierarchy, some of the chapters about racial hierarchies. Okay, that's pretty fascist. But as I say in my book, economic libertarianism overlaps with fascism on social Darwinism. Like winners have value, losers don't. But they're different in other ways. Like a consistent libertarian will never generalize to groups and say, white people have more value than non-whites because they work harder and win more. So there are these overlaps, and I just think it so screams out from you from the literature. It's just universal. You go to Portugal and you go to their museum in Lisbon and they talk about the attack on the labor unions, and it's so universal that it has to be mentioned. But of course you can criticize labor unions and not be a fascist. Yeah.
Thank you.
And for each of these. Thank you.
Where are your parents?
Well, my stepmother is here. And she helped a lot with the book. She gave me, and my brother-in-law is there.
Well, you are profound and you are brilliant, and I think your parents, your family should and friends should be very, very proud of you. Now, I'm well read on Reconstruction, but the issue that you spoke about with respect to anti-unions and wealthy whites in the North coming down, that I have not read about and do not know about. I knew, certainly with Rutherford putting the nail in the casket and, wanting to appease the South and pulling the troops out so that he could win the election. I want you to talk a little bit more about the North and, coming against the labor unions. And I wanted to get your take on what happened in Charleston with the massacre at Mother Emanuel Church, as well as what happened in Charlottesville. Because after listening to you, you do see a theme, and when Trump could say the most horrible thing about McCain, I prefer winners and people who don't get
So I've been spending more time lately for my sins with former members of Nazi parties, and I was so a friend of mine is Tony McClear, the director of executive director of Life After Hate. He spent 20 or so years as a Nazi, and remarkable man. And he's very clear that I think we all know this from David Duke, the long-term goal of the American Nazi Party was to be respectable. And for that, they had to have people who were not respectable. So Tony McClear said at one symposium we were at together, he said, the first time I was on Montel Williams, I was a skinhead with combat boots and tattoos. The second time I wore a suit. And he explains that you need the killers, the radicals out there to say, that's not us. You're seeing this all over Europe now. The Austrian Kurz, Sebastian Kurz, what happens is that the right-wing parties are like, we're not white supremacists. The white supremacists are the ones actually killing people, the ones marching on the streets. We're respectable. We're in government, but they need each other. So in order for the people in power who are pushing white supremacy to plausibly deny that they're white supremacists, they need Charlottesvilles, because they need to say, no, those are white supremacists. And Tony McClear can explain that this has long been the strategy of the American Nazi Party. And David Black, the son of the Stormfront founder, is also very clear about this. He's like, he says, what we hear from our leadership is the kind of things that he said our target audience was always the person who said, I'm not a racist, but ... So you need the Charlottesvilles and the horror of Charleston, which is unspeakable horror of Charleston, because those provide plausible deniability to white supremacy and power.
And we know those of us who study history and who are of a woman of color, as I am, and a descendant of people who were enslaved, both on maternal and maternal side. We always knew in the communities, and certainly in the South, when the KKK took off those hoods, they were your local doctor, your sheriff, your policeman, your store owners. Not all of them, but these were the respectable people, and it was the hood that allowed them to really crucify and hang people. And
the wisdom of the Black American tradition guides me in my book. Ida B. Wells.
Absolutely.
That's
with the lynching,
Angela Davis.
Yes.
Du Bois, obviously, I probably over Du Bois today.
Yes.
I'm sorry for that.
No, that's okay.
But it's
he earned it.
He earned it, right?
Yes.
Exactly. Because it's that literature that you get the insight into the form fascism takes here. And so someone from like me who's from Europe, the sort of particular masks fascism wears here, that's something you really need the Black American literature to understand.
But thank you for your work, and thank your parents.
Thanks. And my brother, my father.
Earlier this year, I read another book by a psychologist named Steven Pinker called Enlightenment Now.
Right, it's staring me in the face right over there.
Oh. And
numbers.
In the book, he argues that the world is getting better and better, and this is the best time to be alive, the best time to be born, and he extols the virtues of the future. And so I want to, ask you what you feel about that. What's your response to that? And are you optimistic about the future? I mean, you're talking about possible fascism in this country.
So let me quote my father's book, The Technological Conscience, where he says, pessimism is very much the humanistic view. He says, I am a pessimist. Pessimism is very much the humanistic view. So that's just to say that I think Pinker, I mean, we could go on about Pinker, I'm not going to. I think that when you count, Césaire already does a takedown of Pinker a long time in Femi. Césaire, what's the Césaire book? I'm just blanking. Well, Discourse on Colonialism. Yeah, thank you. So, and Discourse on Colonialism, where he's like, you count, you tell us about the diseases you've cured. You tell us about the new food that we access from Europe. And yet, what about the religion you destroyed? What about, the traditions you eliminated? What about the ways of life you laid waste to? Can you count those? So Pinker is just like, no, it only matters if you can count it. Dignity doesn't count. You can't count dignity. So you'll also find me criticizing Pinker in recent years. Pinker is not alt-right himself, but Pinker does have a lot of alt-right fans. If you look at Pinker's views about the IQ debate, you'll find some stuff on Pinker there. This idea of we have to face the facts of difference, nature. I mean, I think he's right that, I'm not for banning discussions, but the fascination that he has with the IQ debate is something that I think is kind of worrisome. And I'm worried about the sort of technocratic way of measuring human value. That said, in any country that had the civil rights movement, if I had to do the civil rights movement, I definitely would have done it in Vermont, but they chose like Alabama and Mississippi. So given that, I feel quite safe in the United States. Ultimately, I feel optimistic because this is a country that did that. So the labor movement, Jane Addams.
I just wanted to make two brief comments. One about giving value to things. I mean, if we really just take a quick scan of history, going back to as far as we can go back, it seems like human life does not have a lot of value. And that's just a general comment. And if we look at capitalism and the globalization of everything and all these wars, and like you said, there's 2 wars going on. And I've said this to myself, why is no one talking about our troops that we still have in Afghanistan and Iraq and these places, and they're still getting blown to pieces? And I know because my first job out of college, I worked at the VA hospital in the 70s when the guys were first coming back from Vietnam. So that's just what I wanted to say about the value of human life. Now, on a lighter side, I would like to say what you said about Du Bois, and then you said about the new push for Black studies in colleges, and that it was going to replace Shakespeare.
Yeah,
I know. It was just a joke, but I just wanted to play on that because from my experience and having done Black studies and everything else, there's a lot of credit and study given to Shakespeare. People who
right, Alain Locke, Du Bois, a little bit too much, if you ask me.
yeah. And also, I wanted to say that most of our most appreciated African American actors studied Shakespeare to the hilt.
Right.
And
there's
do
Robeson,
the most,
obviously.
if you haven't had an opportunity, do the most excellent Shakespeare on stage.
No, I mean that is ultimately, the great Jeffrey Stewart Alain Locke biography talks about. I mean, Locke won the sort of literary prize at Harvard for something on Irish poetry, and he gave a talk in a Black church in Cambridge saying, look, the Irish created the greatest, were colonized and oppressed, and their revenge was to create the greatest English language literature and poetry. And he's obviously encouraging, taking that as he's speaking of Paul Dunlap. I think it was also a lecture on Dunlap. Right, absolutely. So, right, and of course, Du Bois sort of takes that to the extreme with The Talented Tenth. I don't mean to, by the way, Pinker is a liberal. Pinker and I have family disputes, ultimately. He's a technocratic liberal of a certain kind. I have family disputes with him, but he's obviously, in some general sense, on my side.
But he's all right.
What?
But he's all right.
He's all right. He's alt-right. No, there are certain aspects of Pinker that the alt-right pick up on. That, the stuff which is a danger of the messaging. So he's definitely not alt-right. It's that you got to be careful. I mean, one should be sensitive to the messages that, like Pinker said recently, I think it was in Davos, on a panel where he said, the alt-right are really bright, tech-savvy people who come to college and realize there are certain topics that you're not allowed to talk about. And then they feel shocked, and then they become alt-right. That's I think that was an irresponsible comment. Of course he's on my side, but I just think that's an irresponsible comment. And of course that's a comment that makes some people, that he does not agree with. It puts them in so that's all I'm saying. Ultimately, we can't have these family disputes between different stripes of liberals. And so I don't want to do that. Though I do want to say, I don't think that's why people become alt-right.
We are unfortunately out of time for questions. Although if you want to make a brief question, if we make it really quick, then we can fit it in.
I don't have a comment. It is a question, but the question is for you to elaborate. Maybe we don't have time for any more elaboration on anti-intellectualism, which was one of the 10, I guess, that you have, and you didn't really say much about it. And it's a case that I see certain parallels with the sort of with the left philosophies of I don't know, class warfare, and it seems like Mao was an anti-intellectual, in many respects.
Yeah, I mean, I think. I think that what you get in fascist ideology is like the straightforward fascist ideology is about appealing to emotion. Not that there's some emotions can be perfectly rational, as Martha Nussbaum, among others, as many philosophers would tell you, but the idea is to cut off reasoning by fear, panic, and then just replace and show and then present yourself as like the solution. You get this very explicitly discussed. In Mein Kampf, Hitler talks about propaganda should appeal to the least educated. So the idea that it's the least educated who your audience or taught. Essentially that's what you want to appeal to. Bannon said we won on lock her up, build a wall. We won on that. But there's a what I talk about in the anti-intellectual chapter is this all across the world right now. We're seeing in the countries I discuss attacks on universities for being bastions of liberalism, feminism. European University of St. Petersburg was closed down because of gender studies. Central European University was was attacked because they're spreading liberalism. So this kind of thing, when you find universities harshly targeted as bastions of leftism, and now of course sometimes they are, not Yale, but Yale's a great place. It's not that, but when you find this hysteria about communism being directed at universities and the media, and now it takes the form of gender studies, panic about gender studies, because that's just like Masha Gessen's clear about that in her 2017 book. That gender studies just seems to be, and Pat McCrory in North Carolina did that. He said, we're not going to have this governor of North Carolina said that we're not going to have the taxpayers paying for gender studies or Swahili. So the idea is so you target universities in your politics. Now, all authoritarians, as you say, target universities in their politics because universities are places where young people protest against older people. And so that's going to be something that as I get older, I recognize the wisdom of seeing that as a problem. But yeah. Thank you.